titled the talk rather ambitiously, "How to Survive the Crushing Weight of the World's Problems."
And we're waiting Monday.
I actually was thinking this afternoon it might have been too ambitious. Because in the end, I'm afraid to tell you this if you don't know it already, there is no survival. In the end, the world will crush us. And there's an image which I really like actually, which is a story from the Suttas, and it's a conversation between the king Pasenadi and the Buddha. And the king comes in and he looks very harried. He's had a very busy day conducting affairs of state. He's probably like the Donald Trump of his day, except that he's a Buddhist. And so he has some access to the Buddha, and he's been very busy with the affairs of state, and he's looking a little bit stressed out. And the Buddha says, "How are you going?" "Oh, well, I've been doing this, I've been doing that, I've had this meeting, that meeting." And the Buddha says, "Well, what would you do, King, if a messenger came to you and said that there's this huge mountain moving in from the east? Size of the mountains of the Himalayas is moving towards you and it's crushing everything in its path." And the king's like, "Oh, well." And then he says, and then another messenger arrives and there's a mountain the same size moving in from the east, or west, I'm not sure which, west. And another mountain moving in from the north, and another mountain moving in from the south. And the king's like, "Oh." And the Buddha says, "This is aging and death. These things are rolling in, and they're going to crush you. So what do you do?" And the king, obviously a little bit smarter than Donald Trump, says, "Well, if we're going to be crushed by giant moving mountains, then the only thing to do is to do good dharma conduct, to do good actions, noble actions, to perform good deeds, to make merit. And so this is what we should do in our life. And this is what people who come to the Association of Engaged Buddhists are obviously into." But I wonder, the impetus for this talk was just looking online one day at all this angst and anger and despair that I could see in my friends who have a practice of caring about the world. And there's in their posts on Facebook and the links that they're subscribing to and things like that, you can see that there's quite a lot of despair in this world. If you pay attention to the world, if you care about it, then you might have these feelings of despair in the mind, because it can seem so overwhelming. The news is full of disasters, wars, environmental tragedies, etc., etc., etc. And I actually was thinking at the time, is it worse today than in previous times? Or is it just that suddenly we have this awareness that's much greater than previous times because of the internet? I think I remember growing up, I had a bit of awareness about what was going on in the world. But in those days, for a story to actually make the news, it had to be pretty important. It had to matter somehow to this, the population of Australia. We might hear about people starving in Africa, but we didn't hear about every single tragedy that was happening in the world. But today, there's so much awareness because of the internet, because of mass media, 24-hour news cycle. Suddenly we've got more and more and more and more knowledge, and perhaps that's why people get a little bit overwhelmed. So if you care about the world, that's one thing. And if you've been around Buddhist circles for some time, you'll see that there's two types of people really in Buddhism. And there's the people who care about the world and are full of compassion, full of concern. And then there's the people who really emphasize a renunciant practice. The world is beyond us, beneath us, we're going to just retire and you turn our back on the world. And for a long time it took me some thinking around, why is there this seeming dichotomy? Why is there these extremes of behaviour? Some people who, so full of love, so full of compassion, and other people who seemingly just want to run away and turn their back on it all. How do we reconcile this? And the reason, of course, is the Buddha himself started this trend. And he started it when he developed the Noble Eightfold Path, and he developed the concept of right intention. Do you know the three things that make up right intention? Samma sankappo, the renunciation, nekkhamma, goodwill, so a lack of hostility, and compassion or non-harmfulness. And so there's these three things: renunciation, goodwill, non-harm, that make up the right intention, the right thought.
Excuse me, Bhante, could you elaborate a little bit on what you understand to be renunciation? It seems to be one of those words that's got kind of bad press in a way.
Yeah, and why is that? Because I think partially because if you have this idea of renunciation, you might think, okay, the Buddha is saying everyone has to become a nun, has to become a monk. But that's not what it is. So renunciation, these things are expressed in kind of negative terms, like non-ill will. Like, what does that even mean? Well, it's saying ill will is bad. We don't want ill will. Non-harmfulness is the negative expression of compassion. And when we say renunciation or giving up, sounds like a negative thing. We have to give something up. I wanted to get stuff on the spiritual path, But the renunciation aspect of right intention is actually about abandoning, voluntarily relinquishing sense desire, kamacchanda. And at first you think, why is this such a big deal, Buddha? Like, why did you talk about this? Why did you put this very first out of these three intentions? And it becomes quite clear that the reason the Buddha said this is because of the problem of sense desire. So with our sense desire, there's a good sutta called the Maha Dukkha Khandha Sutta, which is the great mass of suffering which we experience in the world. And the reason for our suffering is because of our sense desire. So because of wanting sensual pleasure, wanting comfort, wanting good things in our life, we go out and we get a job and we take many risks. We have to catch the bus with humans. We have to work with humans in the office. We have to sit at a computer, get bad posture. We work out in the fields. We have to brave the sun. All this is so that we can have a nice, comfortable home, a roof over our head. So that seemed fine. You might not think there's a big problem with that. It's the way we live. But sense desire is also the problem for us, because once we make money, buy things, we start to worry about those things. We have to get an alarm for the house. We're worried about breaking that thing, losing that thing, having someone steal that thing. And then keep on moving back out from this. Everyone in society is doing the same thing. Everyone wants the same thing. We're all competing with each other for these comforts, these things that we need. What people squabble over, brawl over, what families argue over, what businesses argue over, what countries argue over. This sense desire is what sends countries to war. So this is the problem that the Buddha saw and described in this sutta, that actually sense desire is this kind of thing that agitates people towards wanting. We want what our neighbour has. We want what the newspapers are selling. We want what that country has as a resource. And so this is why sense desire is bad. Yes?
And yet, we also want to be virtuous. We also want to do good. We also want to develop our meditation. We also want, all the paramis to be developed. So how do you reconcile the two seemingly different kind of wants?
So sense desire is desire that is fueled by the senses, the bodily senses. For things like so what the Buddha says is in his two kinds of thought sutta, Dvaita Vitakka Sutta, he says, I characterize my thoughts into two different groups, two different categories. Thoughts that were wholesome, and the thoughts that are wholesome are ones that have good results for myself and for other people. And those thoughts are thoughts of renunciation, thoughts of non-ill will, thoughts of non-harm. And the thoughts that are unwholesome, which have negative results for myself and other people, are thoughts of sense desire, thoughts of ill will, anger, thoughts of harmfulness, hostility to other people. So when he saw like this, he realized that thinking about thoughts that had renunciation, so abandoning sense desire, didn't have any negative consequences. So he could dwell on these thoughts of renunciation for a very long time, and the mind becomes peaceful. So if we allow ourselves to develop this practice of right intention, it's like a cow herd. When our thoughts are full of sense desire, sense of wanting things, sense of wanting to hurt people, harm people, have hostility towards them, it's like a cow herd who has to be really careful. The cows will just go and munch that grass of hostility. They'll just eat it all up, and they'll eat up all the sense desire they can. They're hungry, and that's what happens to our mind. It just indulges in this. It just keeps going. You've seen a cow just chewing away. That's what happens to our mind, the inclination of our mind. So the thoughts that we have characterize the mind like this. And so that's why the Buddha said, restrain the thoughts of sense desire, restrain ill will, restrain harmfulness. And this means that we can have some peace. And so the renunciation is actually key. So it doesn't mean that you have to become a monk, become a nun. The renunciation is just a voluntary stepping back. So you came here tonight, you voluntarily renounced killing. You voluntarily renounced stealing, lying, sexual misconduct. You voluntarily relinquished alcohol. I don't know if you knew what you were saying, but that's what the precept says. So this, as you understand, is your protection, your restraint. And when we practice in this way, we can get many benefits. There's a wonderful sutta where another king is sitting alone in the forest after having abandoned the world to become a monk. And he's sitting there and he says, Aho Sukham, which means, the bliss, the bliss. And someone hears this and they're like, what is going on? And so they demand that he goes and sees the Buddha. And the Buddha's like, well, why are you saying the bliss, the bliss? And he says, well, before I was a king, I had so many responsibilities. I had a palace, I had people, I had to have guards at my door because I was so worried that someone would come and kill me. But now I'm a monk, I'm in the forest, I have nothing at all, no possessions, no money, no responsibilities, and now I have this bliss. And so that's the power of renunciation. There are dangers to renunciation. Perhaps you've seen it in some people. You might have met them in spiritual circles. The spiritually superior renunciants, the people who are pretty tight, the world is beneath me, your problems, it's meaningless. The world is an illusion. your suffering is an illusion. This is an incorrect kind of renunciation, because it just leads to an inflation of the ego. Instead of relinquishing this sense of self, they're actually piling it on. I'm so much better than you. I can sit for 4 hours without moving. I go on silent retreats and I never open my mouth. You know, this is a kind of spiritual ego. So this is a danger that can come from renunciation, and the Buddha mentioned this in the Umbadharika Sutta, where he talked about the blemishes that can come from this spiritually superior attitude. So we've got to be careful, but we have to understand that the Buddha talked about renunciation, and the reason why we need to renounce things, we need to let go of things, is because this is what will allow us to develop the clarity of mind, the vastness of mind, the peace that we need to develop those other two right intentions, the non-ill will, that is the metta bhavana, the loving kindness, and the non-harm, that is the karuna bhavana, the compassion. Why? Voluntarily letting go of your sense desire is what kindness is. If you have one last, what are we going to say, Tim Tam, and there's another person sitting there, and you think, I'm going to have this all to myself. This is a selfish intention. This is a sense desire. If you relinquish that sense desire, relinquish that selfish intention, you're practicing goodwill. If you think, I'm going to, out of compassion for this person's hunger, give them this last Tim Tam, then you're practicing karuna bhavana, kindness, compassion. And so that's why the Buddha said that this renunciation was so important, because it's the training of the mind, training of the body, that allows these things to develop. Gus?
But it seems to me, if I've understood anything at all about your take on renunciation, as it comes from the sutras, it seems to me that you're talking, I'm inferring this, that you're talking more about samatha practice rather than vipassana practice. In my vipassana practice, I allow whatever thought arises to arise. I don't try to stomp on it or put it aside or replace it with a wholesome thought. I just allow it to arise. I don't judge it as being negative or positive, wholesome, unwholesome, skillful, unskillful. I simply allow it to be with an open heart and with clear comprehension and just the metta and the sati. So when I do that, it just dissolves.
Part of the reason for that is because what's happening in your practice is that you're actually relinquishing your sense of will. So you're abandoning this desire for control.
Yeah.
But in terms of the topic that I'm speaking on tonight, the idea that we shouldn't judge is actually a very dangerous idea. There is the necessity to make a distinction between what is wholesome and what is unwholesome. And the Buddha said that we should not, when he was having a chat with an ascetic in the Futile Sutta, he says, this ascetic says, well, I'm spiritually cool, and I don't think we should really judge anything. And the Buddha says, well, no, we should praise what is praiseworthy, and we should criticize what is not to be praised. And the whole of the Buddha's ethical system revolves around this concept. So we need to, as people who are engaged Buddhists, to reflect upon this constantly. But we need to do it in a sophisticated way. We need to do it in a way that allows for us to sustain our compassionate aspect. So if we're speaking out all the time about what's good and what's wrong, but not practicing it ourselves, then we've got a problem. There's a wonderful sutta called the Sutta of the cremation log, the Chavalakta Sutta, and in it the Buddha says there's 4 types of people. The first person is the person who doesn't practice for himself or herself and doesn't practice for others. So the person doesn't have any spiritual practice, doesn't have any care about their ethical conduct, doesn't care about anyone else's ethical conduct. And the Buddha said that this person is like a log of wood burnt at both ends and covered with shit in the middle. No one wants it. Useless. Burnt at both ends, covered with excrement. Doesn't do anyone any good in the forest. Doesn't do anyone any good in the city. So this is the kind of practitioner that you can encounter from time to time. Someone who just doesn't care about their own conduct, doesn't care about others. And the second person the Buddha describes in this sutta is someone who practices for other people's benefit, but not for their own. So kind of like martyr kind of figure, maybe someone who maybe they tell people, do this, do that, it will help you, but they don't do it themselves. And this person, the Buddha says, is better than the shit-covered log. But there's a third person, and that third person is someone who practices for themselves, but not for others. And the Buddha says, out of these 3 people, that second person is better than the shit-covered log, but the third person is better than both those other 2. So that means the third person who practices for themselves, but not for others, is actually better than the person who practices for others, but not themselves. Are you following? Yeah? And you think, how can this is so un-Buddhist, isn't it? Like, what is going on here, Buddha? What's the, you think, surely someone who practices for the benefit of others is better than someone who's selfish? Aren't we supposed to be compassionate? Aren't we supposed to have these beautiful qualities? And the reason, of course, is that this person is taking care of their stuff by practicing. You might think of it as the oxygen mask analogy. So when the plane's going down, put your own mask on first before you help others. Very good, everyone's been very trained. And that's what we must do as practitioners of the Buddhist path. That's what the Buddha did himself. He got his stuff sorted, did it very well, became enlightened, and then helped others. And so the image he actually used, he didn't use the gas mask, oxygen mask analogy. He used the image of someone stuck in a paddy field. So if you wade into that mud with the person stuck in that paddy field, you're stuck too. But if you're on the edge, you can use a stick and you can take them out. So this is what the Buddha meant by practicing renunciation. You step away from the world, just for a little time, 15 minutes a day, 1 day a week, 1 retreat a year, whatever you can manage. You get that clarity, you get that peace of mind, and you see just what is possible through the practice of renunciation to develop. So by stepping aside from the world, by sitting here for half an hour practicing meditation, you're creating good karmic actions that will have good karmic results. Wholesome actions, wholesome results. You sit down and meditate, pretty soon you become calm and peaceful. So it's very important. The fourth person, though, in case you thought that was the best person, the fourth person, of course, is the person who practices for themselves and for others. And this person the Buddha compared to ghee. You know ghee? Clarified butter? So it's like the most purified, most clarified product that comes from milk. And the Buddha said that this is the kind of person we should be like. We should become like ghee, not like the log. And so this is why the Buddha emphasized renunciation, because it's only through that practice of stepping back that we can actually get the clarity that we need to see just what kind of a mess we're in. That's how we see suffering, and that's how we understand the cause of suffering, and how we can create the path to escape it.
Guys, shall we let one take continue? Yes. And if you hold our question to the end of it, I'm sure everybody would like to hear what.
Because I've only got 10 minutes left.
Yeah.
And I'm still on the first the next bit I was thinking of talking about is how do we actually practice compassion and loving kindness well? Because if there's some potential flaws in our practice of renunciation, in that we can become too distant, too cold, too uncaring about the world around us, then are there also some similar flaws in our compassion? It's very easy to kind of say, I'm compassionate, I love the world, I practice metta, I love all the beings, and then we walk outside and we run into someone we don't like and we hate them. Or we think, yes, I practice loving kindness and compassion for all these people except that one who annoys me. So how are we going to develop this mind perfectly? And the way to do that is through renunciation, by letting go of any desire attached to our practice of compassion and loving kindness. And for people who are involved in engaged Buddhism, people who are actively cultivating a loving kindness practice, a compassionate practice, this is a danger for us. If we have a vested interest in our practice of compassion, then it's polluted somehow, because we have an interest in the result. So, for example, you see people practicing compassion with a lot of ego. My charity, my interest, my special group, my particular niche social problem. And we have this kind of sense that it belongs to us, that we kind of have ownership over it. And if anyone says something bad about it, we start defending it, And you see this a lot in the type of giving that is considered good. Some people think that if you give people soup, like the soup kitchen, that you're just doing them a disservice because you're just putting a Band-Aid on the problem, you're not creating a good problem. Then you're like, but I love giving soup, I feel good. And it's your ego that's involved there. The thing that I'm actually remembering is this YouTube video I saw, which was about this guy who was called the kindest person in the world, which is quite a statement, isn't it? And this guy, who I think was a nice man, he decided to have this project where he went around and helped people. You may have seen this video, it went viral, like millions and millions of people watched it. And at the start of the video, he's like, yeah, I'm just going to do kind things, I'm going to write a blog post, how can I help you? And then he didn't get any responses, so he went out on the street with a television crew and started to ask people, how can I help you? And you just see these people just kind of going, because there's a television crew there. And of course, I don't know about you, but if a stranger came up to me with a television crew, like already I'm like, whoa, what's going on here? But he couldn't see that, because he was like, people just don't want to accept my help. And it's still all about him. But actually, I think these people were like, actually, I don't know who you are and I don't want your help, because no. And so he kept trying, and eventually someone said, okay, you can help me out. And then he felt good. He's like, yes. And he felt useful, and he was able to practice his compassion. The problem I have with this isn't that he was trying to be nice, it's the way he was doing it. If you want to be nice, it doesn't matter if there are television cameras there. If you want to be nice, it doesn't matter. If you want to give money to a hospital, give. You don't need to put your name on the hospital. So when we practice things like compassion, we have to be aware that there's a danger. If our ego is involved, if we have some sort of desire for some sort of result, desire for some expectation, then there's a lot of our self being involved there. A similar thing, and it's quite common, I think, with online activism, and that is anger. So anger is another defilement that can enter our compassion. Outrage. And if you've been online and you've gotten involved in any conversations, and you know what I mean, like there's, particular interest group, could be Palestine, Israel, refugees, water preservation, whatever, whales, and it's actually tempting sometimes to succumb to our defilement of anger and hate, because we believe so strongly in this issue. We really want for this issue to be fixed, but we've got to be careful that we don't damage all our other relations in the meantime, because there's a little bit of a hierarchy at play sometimes with our compassion. You might think it's really important to find the best, most beneficial cause to target for your compassionate activities. It's not a competition though, and it could be that at times, if you're focusing on people all the way over the other side of the world, events that you can't possibly influence, can't possibly control, and yet having fights online with people about if it's good or bad, or yelling at your family for not supporting your cause, your charity, then perhaps you've started to miss the point of this compassion thing, because actually anyone around us could be suffering. Anyone could be a deserving target of our compassionate activity. And sometimes we get inflated when we think, I helped the refugees. You might not have helped your next door neighbour when they were struggling with that large piece of furniture. Why is it more important for you to have this big cause? So sometimes when it comes to our compassion, we have to remember that actually the way to practice is to just be nice to the people around us. And if everyone was nice to the people around us, eventually, these larger problems would kind of solve themselves. And so at the beginning of our practice, when we practice renunciation, when we practice compassion, it's actually this movement internally that develops externally. So when we practice renunciation, we're developing that. When we practice metta or loving kindness or compassion, it's not an external thing, it's an internal attitude shift. And so when we come to, the problems of the world, we can start with ourselves, start with the people around us, and then hopefully over time we can grow that compassion, make it larger, make it bigger. If more people are kind to each other, they see us being kind, they see us being charitable, they see us giving, they see us doing good work, then that influences people. If we start getting angry, if we start abusing people online, if we're so worked up about this particular issue, we're so tense in our domestic environment that we put people off around us with our negativity, with our angst, with our outrage, then we're not practicing the Buddha's path. The thing that's going to help us, maintain our compassion, maintain our loving kindness, is that ability to practice renunciation, to step back from these activities from time to time, so that we can have the opportunity to gain clarity of mind, to let go of the anger, to let go of the aggression, let go of the ego, to cultivate the peace, to cultivate the correct view, and to create harmony in our own minds. And then when we come back to the world, that's what we bring to our compassionate activities. There's a really good sutta which helps us think about the need to have this balanced approach, and it's called the Sutta of the Seven Sons. And I'll finish on that tonight. It is a pretty trippy sutta. It's kind of quite out there. It's the Buddha saying, in the future, a second sun will appear in the sky. And so, with the second sun, it gets a bit hotter. And for thousands of years, for hundreds of thousands of years, it doesn't rain. All the plant life starts to decay and die. And then a third sun appears in the sky. It gets even hotter. And all the rivers start to dry up. And then a fourth sun appears in the sky. All the lakes start to evaporate. And then a fifth sun appears. It's getting pretty hot now. All the oceans are starting to drop and drop and drop and drop. And pretty soon, it says in the sutta that the oceans, all the oceans of the world, just come to this level of a palm tree. And then they drop, and they drop, and then they're human size, and then they drop and drop, and they get down to your knees, and they drop and drop, they're down by your ankles, and eventually there's no water left. But it doesn't stop there, because a sixth sun appears in the world and starts to heat things up big time. All the mountains start to smoke. And then the seventh sun appears in the sky, and the whole earth is so hot, it's like a kiln, and eventually the earth explodes. It's pretty intense. The point of this, of course, the Buddha was saying, this is the nature of the world. This is what happens in the world. There is suffering. We cannot control it. We cannot control the sun. Maybe we cannot prevent global warming. Maybe we cannot prevent bad things happening in the world. We have to, in our spiritual practice, develop a sense of equanimity to what's going on in the world. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't act, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned, but there's a time for action, there's a time for accepting as well. And this is the wisdom aspect of our compassion. Eventually we have to accept that we're small, that the issues of the world are big, and the suffering in the world is massive. Our ability to survive the crushing weight of the world's problems depends on our ability to help ourselves. And our ability to help others depends on our ability to help ourselves. And that's why the Buddha pointed towards these three right intentions: renunciation, non-ill will, non-harm, to allow us to develop those beautiful qualities by stepping back, having some clarity, seeing what the mind is, seeing what the nature of our suffering is, and then being able to use that peace, that stillness, that calm, to develop those beautiful, immeasurable qualities of metta, of compassion. And by hopefully doing that, drop in the ocean perhaps, but every drop fills the gullies, fills the rivers, fills the lakes, and fills the ocean. And so that's how the Buddha taught us to practice. There's a few minutes for questions. Gus?
I'll let somebody else go.
Hunter, you know, in the practice that you did, where we reflect on our virtuous actions and feel the joy in that, I always find that a really difficult practice to do, because it seems to me that however much good you attempt to do, it's never enough.
It's always enough. Whatever you attempt to do is much better than doing nothing, and it's so much better than doing the opposite of those actions. So this is why when the Buddha, especially when he phrased these things in this way, you might think this doesn't make any sense, this negative formulation of non-ill will. But think of what ill will is. It's hate, it's aggression, it's anger, it's irritability, it's callousness, it's competitiveness, rivalry. It's just being horrible to other people in your mind. And that's what you have in your mind, and that's what you take with you out into the world. So non-ill will is actually pretty good. It's not bad. It's enough. And so if you can, when you see the mind like this, when it doesn't have any ill will in it, when it's peaceful, when it's calm, when it feels a sense of love and kindness to people, it's beautiful. It's so beautiful. It's so clean. It's spotless. It is glorious. And it feels excellent. The bliss that you will get from this practice is extreme bliss. It's the bliss that is better than sex, better than drugs, better than any other kind of bliss that you can imagine. And if you've got that in your heart, then you should pretty well. If you can give that to other people, then it's even better. But the basis for that is, this desire to create a beautiful mind and to abandon the defilements that impede that beautiful mind from appearing. So when you reflect upon your goodness, it's an opportunity for you to do two things. One is to just acknowledge that you're a good person, that you've actually done something that is good. And for a lot of people, if you have a negative self-esteem, or you're worried you're never good enough, you're worried that you haven't done enough, just do a little accounting. See, actually, today I did this, and this, and this, and I was a good person today. I wasn't a bad person, And what this does, the second thing it does is inclines our mind towards goodness and towards good actions. So when we become aware of the benefits of being a good person, we want to do it again and again and again. So it increases our desire to do these good actions. And when you do these good actions with a mind of intention, it's very, very powerful. That is where the mind will be conditioned. That is where the mind will come from this level up to this level. And if you keep on conditioning the mind in this way, keep on doing these good actions, keep on creating this good effect in the mind, then you just keep on moving further and further and further ahead on the spiritual path. That is the driving force that will revolutionize your practice, and it feels pretty good inside the mind. So just keep going. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I actually have the opposite thought like Sue, because if I sort of meditate on my good deed, my fear is that I'll become attached to my good deed and become self-praising. Oh yeah, I've done so many good things today.
I don't think that's a problem. You can use desire to get over desire. So as Gus pointed out before, we've got this spiritual desire to do good things. And so the Buddha says, fine, use desire to abandon desire, by cultivating wholesome desires. You can't abandon desire by cultivating unwholesome desires. So if we're on the spiritual path and we think, okay, instead of meditating, I'm going to go and eat pizza, in the casino or whatever, not much chance. But if you're on the spiritual path and you think, okay, I'm going to do a good deed for a person, then that's going to make a really strong imprint on the mind. But it's the intention, knowing that you're doing it for a purpose. And the reason this is important is because of several things. One is when we reflect upon our good conduct, it brightens the mind. It brings joy to the mind, brings happiness. The deeper states of meditation require this joy, this happiness. And at the end of our life, when we look back, when we're dying, we can reflect upon the good things that we've done.
So you think we should keep a record of all the good things we've done, like counting for good things?
You don't need to keep a record. So you've heard that when people die, their life flashes before their eyes. Regardless of what you do, your life is going to flash before your eyes. So, what do you want to be flashing before your eyes? Do you want to have these things that you've done that have been beneficial to yourself and others? Or do you want to have the casino and the pizza? So, these things make it easier to let go at the end. Knowing that we've done good, we don't have to fear the future rebirth either. You know that you've done good actions. Those good actions always have good results. So, yeah, keep a list. Look at your list often. Remind yourself to do good things. Yeah, don't become that person I talked about before, that spiritual egoist, But reflect upon it. You're a good person. These are good actions. Encourage other people to do good actions, to care about others, and to create beautiful things in the world. That's what the Buddha did. He listed his good qualities. He told us the good actions that he's done. He encouraged other people to create those good qualities in themselves. And it's very profound, and still going today, well over 2,500 years later. So, the effect that we can have in the world is immeasurable.